Some words don't end a marriage the moment they are spoken. They begin ending the moment they are believed. But the true collapse usually starts in silence. A silence so profound it can swallow 8 years of devotion in a single evening. The winter storm battered the floor-to-ceiling glass of our master suite, a high-altitude fortress tucked deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The snow fell in heavy, blinding sheets, burying the vast grounds under a thick layer of white isolation. Inside, the climate was perfectly regulated, yet the space felt completely stripped of warmth. I stood before the tall mirror, my hands resting lightly on the heavy charcoal wool of my husband's shoulders. Julian was already miles away, his focus locked on the reflection of his own cuffs as he adjusted a pair of platinum links. He was a man who commanded a sprawling, unforgiving syndicate, navigating a world where absolute authority was the only currency that mattered. He required a life utterly lacking domestic friction, and for nearly a decade, I had been the invisible architect providing it. Resting open on the marble vanity beside us was the leather-bound dossier. It was a thick, meticulously updated journal that held the true operational core of the Vance family's public existence. Within its heavy pages, I had spent the last 3 months mapping out the precise logistics for tonight's winter estate banquet. I had arranged the seating charts to keep volatile lieutenants separated by neutral loyalists. I had monitored the catering timelines, syncing them with the security shift changes at the perimeter gates. I had even memorized the dietary restrictions of men who would sooner burn down a warehouse than admit a physical weakness. My invisible labor kept his empire from bleeding out on the dining room floor. He did not read the dossier. He did not need to. He simply stepped into the flawless reality I constructed for him every single day. My eyes caught a microscopic flaw, a single loose, dark thread fraying near the seam of his left shoulder. Scissors were across the room in a velvet sewing kit. Instead of breaking his concentration, I stepped closer, leaning into the sharp scent of his cedar and bergamot cologne. I caught the stray silk thread between my teeth and snapped it clean. The abrasive texture of the wool brushed my cheek. The gesture was fiercely intimate, a raw act of care in a room made of glass and stone. Julian did not flinch. He did not look down. He was entirely accustomed to the friction of his life being sanded away before he could even feel it. Before stepping back, I slipped a small, laminated personal medication card into the inner breast pocket of his vest. It contained his blood pressure schedule and the exact timing for the headache relief he would inevitably need by midnight, arranged perfectly so he would never have to ask a subordinate for a pill. I smoothed the lapel flat. My hands lingered for a fraction of a second. The northern routes are cleared for the arrivals, Julian said, addressing his own reflection rather than me. He checked the dial of his watch, turning toward the door and leaving my hands hovering in the empty air. The temperature of the estate seemed to drop the lower I went, the quiet of our private quarters giving way to the sprawling, public theater of the ground floor. The grand banquet hall was a cavern of polished marble and suspended crystal. By the time I reached the bottom of the curving staircase, the space hummed with the calculated murmur of high society predators. The vast chandeliers cast a fragmented, icy light over the long dining tables. I moved through the room, checking the alignment of the silver cutlery and the exact placement of the white floral centerpieces. Everything had to be immaculate. The Vance family demanded nothing less than perfection, especially from someone they considered an outsider. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance opened, letting in a sudden, biting gust of winter wind. Victoria Vance stepped over the threshold. Julian's mother wore a heavy cashmere coat draped over her shoulders, her posture rigid with inherited arrogance. She did not walk into a room, she held court in it. The snow swirled around her expensive leather boots as if afraid to touch them. She shed her coat without looking back, trusting Clara, our veteran housekeeper, to catch the heavy fabric before it touched the floor. Behind Victoria stood Dante Vance, wearing a smirk that mirrored his mother's perpetual disdain. I approached the foyer. In my right hand, I carried a silver tray bearing a single crystal glass of our most exclusive reserve vintage, poured exactly to the ambient temperature she preferred. It was an olive branch, an unbroken tradition of respect I offered, regardless of how many times it had been rejected. "The roads must have been treacherous," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "Please, warm yourself." Victoria stopped. Her dark, calculating eyes swept over my velvet dress, finding it lacking before dropping to the glass in my hand. She did not reach for it. Instead, she let the silence stretch, allowing the surrounding guests to turn and witness the exact geometry of our power dynamic. The red liquid caught the light of the chandeliers, projecting a fractured ruby pattern against the white marble floor. She raised a single, manicured finger, bypassing me entirely to catch the attention of a passing waiter. "Bring me a bottle," Vittoria instructed the young man, her voice carrying a cultured, devastating clarity. "One whose seal has not yet been broken. I prefer to know exactly whose hands have touched what I consume." The implication hung in the cold air. She was not rejecting the wine. She was rejecting the hands that held it. I held the tray steady. 10 feet away, Julian was standing near the archway, deep in a hushed logistical conversation with Marcus Brody, his security chief. Julian had heard her. I saw the slight pause in his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew exactly what his mother had just done. He possessed the power to silence a room with a single glance, the authority to demand respect for his wife without raising his voice. He turned back to Marcus and resumed his conversation. I looked at the pristine, untouched liquid in the glass. Carefully, without making a sound, I lowered the silver tray to a nearby console table. I offered the matriarch a serene, composed nod, leaving the wine exactly where it was. It wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation, it was clarity. The banquet hall smelled faintly of roasted thyme and old money. The long mahogany dining table sat 20 of the most influential figures in the Vance syndicate, yet the room felt entirely dictated by the woman seated at the opposite end. Vittoria tapped the side of her champagne flute with a silver dessert spoon. The ringing sound cut through the low murmur of conversation like a scalpel. Everyone quieted. The staff, moving silently along the perimeter, froze in place. Vittoria stood slowly, her pearls catching the dim light. She raised her glass, looking down the length of the table toward Julian, and then, shifting her gaze directly to me. "To the Vance legacy," my mother-in-law began, her voice smooth and carrying the practiced elegance of a blade. "A bloodline forged in iron, built by men who understood that power is not borrowed, it is inherited." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, her lips curved into a patronizing smile. "Of course, every grand estate occasionally requires a bit of ordinary dusting. A reminder of the dirt outside our gates, just so we can appreciate the marble within." A few quiet chuckles rippled down the table. Next to Vittoria, Dante leaned back in his chair, swirling his dark wine. "It's a charitable act, really," my brother-in-law drawled, his tone laced with lazy arrogance. "Bringing in someone who knows how to scrub the floors, even if she's wearing our name. Some families buy art. We adopt the help." The air in the room grew completely still. The insult was a public execution of my dignity, delivered in front of the capos and the very staff I had spent months managing. My complexion remained perfectly even. I simply turned my head and looked directly at the man sitting on my left. Julian. My husband possessed the authority to silence Vittoria and Dante with one word. I waited for that word. I waited for the slight shift in his posture that signaled his protection. He did nothing. Julian held his crystal tumbler of scotch. The ice cracked softly. For one stretched second, he lifted his dark eyes and met mine. I saw no surprise in his expression, only calculating stillness. Then, deliberately, he looked away. He lowered his gaze to the table. His large hand shifted the heavy glass, aligning its geometric base perfectly with the long grain of the mahogany wood. He adjusted it a fraction of an inch to the right. Perfect symmetry. Total avoidance. He lifted the scotch and took a slow, measured sip. He had chosen. The silence was an active endorsement. In that quiet gesture, my husband sacrificed me to preserve his peace. There is a specific kind of coldness that doesn't freeze. It evaporates. In the seconds following Julian's deliberate sip of scotch, the devotion I had carried for 8 years dissolved into the conditioned air of the banquet hall. People often mistake politeness for peace. They are not the same thing. Dante was still smirking. Vittoria remained standing, waiting for me to break, waiting for the frantic defense of my own worth. She wanted a scene. She wanted to prove I was too ordinary to sit beside the head of their empire. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I reached for my silver fork. My hand did not shake. I cut a small piece of seared duck, placed it in my mouth, and chewed with unhurried grace. The men and women around the table watched me, their expressions shifting to quiet uncertainty. The tension thickened, suffocating everyone except me. I felt incredibly light. "The duck is exceptional tonight," I said, my voice pitched at a serene, conversational volume. I looked past my mother-in-law, catching the eye of the head waiter. "Please send my compliments to the chef and ensure the lower end of the table has their wine refilled." The older man blinked, startled by my absolute composure, before bowing quickly. I did not look at Julian again. His physical presence, the broad shoulders in the tuxedo I had brushed clean hours ago, suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. He was just a man sitting at a table. For the next 40 minutes, I performed my role flawlessly. I smiled at appropriate anecdotes, directed the staff with subtle nods, and maintained the flow of the evening. I gave them exactly what they demanded, a flawless ornament. When the final dessert plates were cleared, I looked down at the heavy silk napkin resting in my lap. I picked it up by the corners. With slow, deliberate movements, I folded the dark fabric in half. I pressed my thumb along the crease, smoothing the silk until the edge was razor sharp. I folded it again, creating a perfect, exacting triangle. I placed the folded napkin precisely over the center of my untouched plate. It was a final, geometric closure. I pushed my chair back quietly and stood. The low hum of conversation faltered. "If you will excuse me," I announced, offering the room a hollow smile that did not reach my eyes. "It has been a remarkable evening. Enjoy the rest of the wine." I turned and walked away. My heels clicked in a steady, unhurried rhythm against the marble floor. I did not look back to see if my husband was watching me. I walked out of the banquet hall, leaving behind the invisible weight I had carried for them all. I was already awake when Julian descended the grand staircase at dawn. For 8 years, my mornings had begun exactly 1 hour before his. By the time his feet touched the cold hardwood floor, the estate was supposed to be breathing. Warm light in the study. The low hum of the espresso machine. This morning, I provided none of it. I stood quietly in the heavy shadow of the arched dining room doorway, watching my husband step into a kitchen that felt like a marble mausoleum. The sprawling space was completely silent. Julian stopped near the center island. He looked toward the espresso machine, his brow furrowing in deep confusion when he found it dark. He reached out to touch the brushed steel exterior, pulling his hand back slowly. Instead of his usual immaculate espresso shot, there was only the ceramic teacup resting on the otherwise spotless white marble counter. It was empty, save for a thin rim of dried Darjeeling tea, completely cold to the touch. A small, intentional disruption in a house that demanded absolute visual perfection. His gaze shifted to the small silver tray stationed near the secondary sink. Every morning for the past 4 years, a precise dosage of his blood pressure medication had waited on that tray in a small crystal cup. He never had to think about it. Today, the surface was bare, reflecting only the gray light filtering through the frosted windows. I watched my husband, a man who ruthlessly controlled the logistics of an entire underground syndicate, open the upper cabinet. Wrong cabinet. It was full of highball glasses. He closed it, his jaw tightening. He opened the next one, spices. He pulled open a heavy oak drawer, polished silverware. He did not know where his own medicine was kept. He had never needed to know. Clara, our head housekeeper, entered the kitchen through the swinging service door, freezing instantly when she saw him. She carried a woven basket of freshly pressed linens, her sharp eyes darting from his bewildered stance to the empty counter, and then briefly to the dark hallway where I stood hidden. Julian turned to her. "Where are my pills?" Clara did not flinch. "In the left pantry, Mr. Vance. Top shelf. Should I fetch them for you?" He didn't answer immediately. He stared at the blank space where his daily dosage cup normally sat. He was a feared king standing inside a fortress he did not actually know how to operate. "No," he muttered finally. "I will find them." But he didn't move. He just stood there in the cold light of the winter dawn, staring blankly at my empty teacup. He found me 30 minutes later in his private study. I was not organizing his correspondence or preparing his schedule. I was simply standing by the massive panoramic window, watching the dense morning fog roll over the pine trees of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The glass was freezing against my fingers, but I did not pull my hand away. The cold felt like clarity. Julian entered with heavy, deliberate steps, the oak door clicking shut behind him. He was fully dressed in a bespoke dark suit, but his silk tie was slightly off-center. A minor detail to anyone else, yet on a man who demanded flawless presentation, it looked like a profound failure. Elena, His voice carried that specific warning edge he usually reserved for disobedient subordinates. He walked toward the center of the room, stopping abruptly when he noticed the glaring absence of his daily briefing folder. "What is the meaning of this morning? The kitchen is freezing. The staff is walking on eggshells, and my medication was hidden like a game." I turned slowly to face him. I offered him a serene, vacant smile, the exact kind of polite, emotionally barren expression a high-end hotel concierge gives to a difficult guest. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," I said softly, my voice drained of any familiar warmth. Julian recoiled slightly, his posture stiffening. He had expected anger. He had expected me to demand an apology for his mother's cruelty the night before, for his cowardice. Anger was a language he knew how to manage. Anger meant I still cared enough to fight for my place beside him. My calm meant something had already ended. "Mr. Vance?" he repeated, his dark eyes narrowing in dangerous confusion. "Are you going to punish the entire household for a few thoughtless remarks at a family dinner party?" I walked with measured steps over to his mahogany desk. From my pocket, I withdrew the silver keyring. It held the heavy access keys to the estate's main quarters and the private executive elevator. I set it down carefully on the dark wood. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the cavernous silence of the study. "I am not punishing you," I replied, free from any emotional accusation. "I am simply resigning from a position I was never formally hired to do." I picked up a plain manila folder and slid it across the smooth surface toward him. He looked down at it. "What is this?" "It is a meticulously compiled list of 3 elite executive assistant agencies," I explained. "They can coordinate your daily medication, organize your private syndication meetings, and manage Clara and the rest of the staff with absolute efficiency." His jaw clenched. "I don't need a management agency, Elena. I have you." "You had a wife," I corrected him gently. "But as your family made abundantly clear last night, and as your silence confirmed, I am merely an unpedigreed ornament taking up space. Ornaments do not brew espresso at dawn, Mr. Vance. Ornaments do not manage blood pressure prescriptions, nor do they shield you from the daily friction of your own life." Julian stared down at the heavy metallic loop resting beside the folder. He opened his mouth to command me to stop this ridiculous performance. But the words died in his throat. Her warmth remained exactly the same. It simply no longer belonged to him by default. "I have instructed Clara to direct all future household inquiries to your corporate office," I said, moving toward the door. "Have a highly productive day, Mr. Vance." I walked out, leaving the most powerful man in the city standing entirely paralyzed in the cavernous quiet of a room that no longer catered to his existence. The most absolute separation is not marked by slammed doors, but by the quiet withdrawal of a devoted heart. By Wednesday afternoon, the sprawling main suite of the Vance estate was perfectly, impeccably silent. The pale winter sunlight filtered through the towering panes of glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs. There was no frantic packing, no torn photographs, no dramatic letter left on the bed. Instead, I conducted a calm, structured audit of my existence. Clara stood near the arched doorway of the private library, her hands folded neatly over the white apron tied around her waist. She had brought 3 empty cardboard boxes at my quiet request. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but the tight line of her mouth and the steady way she watched me carried a deep, unspoken comprehension. She did not offer empty pity, and I did not ask for permission. We simply moved in tandem. Words would have only cheapened the absolute finality of the afternoon. I turned my attention to the towering mahogany bookshelves that spanned the entire length of the room. My fingers brushed the spines, reading the history of my long tenure in this house through the texture of the bindings. I reached past the pristine, gold-leafed first editions of classic literature, the ones Julian had instructed his assistants to purchase in bulk, to ensure the room appeared adequately cultured to his syndicate associates. They were beautiful, expensive, and entirely hollow. I left every single one of them untouched on the shelves. Instead, I pulled out a frayed paperback I had bought during a rainy afternoon in a small coastal bookstore. I selected the worn volumes of architecture and history that I had studied late at night while waiting for Julian's armored cars to return. I was systematically separating the artifacts of my own independent mind from the ornaments of his wealth. I refused to take a single item that carried his financial footprint or his supposed sentiment. His provision was no longer a currency I was willing to accept. Clara silently stepped forward, holding the cardboard box open as I lowered the stack of books into it. The cardboard scraped softly against the polished wood floor. A quiet, definitive sound. Once the few boxes were packed, we carried them down the long, echoing corridor toward the east wing. This section of the estate had been abandoned since Julian's father passed away, its heavy oak doors locked, its furniture draped in white linen sheets. The air here was noticeably colder. It carried the faint, metallic scent of disuse, settling dust, and old rain trapped against the stone window panes. I unlocked the main guest room and set my box down on the bare floorboards. I removed the sheet from a simple reading chair and placed my worn books on a modest wooden shelf. I hung my own coats in the narrow, dark closet. It was not the glass and marble castle of the Vance family. It was cold, small, and entirely isolated. Yet, as I smoothed the wrinkles from my wool sweater and looked out at the frost-covered grounds, my chest felt remarkably light. The space was finally mine. It took Julian exactly 4 hours to notice the physical void I had left behind. The heavy, measured thud of his footsteps echoed down the long corridor of the east wing just after sunset. He walked with the rapid, irritated cadence of a man who believed every inconvenience was a temporary glitch in his otherwise perfectly controlled empire. He did not knock softly. His knuckles rapped against the heavy oak door with a sharp, authoritative rhythm, a command, not a request. I turned the brass knob and pulled the door inward, but I did not step back. I stood squarely on the threshold, planting my feet on the dividing line between the cold hallway and my new sanctuary. Julian loomed in the dim, flickering light of the corridor's antique sconces. His tailored charcoal suit, perfectly pressed and imposing, looked bizarrely out of place against the settling dust and peeling wallpaper of the abandoned wing. He adjusted his silver cufflink, a nervous tick he only ever displayed when a negotiation was failing to follow his script. "What exactly is this, Elena?" he asked. His voice was low, coated in a thick layer of forced patience. "Are we playing games now? Because my schedule this week does not allow for theatrics." I looked at him. I only observed his rigid jaw and the tense line of his shoulders. "I am not playing anything. Julian," I answered, my voice steady and free from malice. "I am simply inhabiting a space that accurately reflects our reality." He let out a short, cynical breath, shaking his head. He shifted his weight, instinctively preparing to step past me into the room, to claim the space with his physical presence the way he claimed territories and boardrooms across the city. But I did not move. I held my ground on the threshold, offering him the exact same polite, impenetrable wall one might present to an uninvited solicitor. Julian stopped. His dark eyes widened slightly as the realization hit him. He could not cross the doorway without physically forcing his way past his own wife, an act that would shatter his cultivated image of absolute composure. The architectural boundary had suddenly become a moral one. "This is ridiculous," he said, dropping the corporate mask, his tone edging into genuine frustration. "Marcus is confused about the security rotations. The staff is asking questions. Dante is supposed to be here for a strategy dinner tomorrow night. You are making a public spectacle out of nothing. Pack these boxes and come back to the main suite immediately." I offered him a placid, formal expression. It was the identical, hollow look I used to greet business rivals at his foundation galas. "You may tell the staff whatever you find convenient," I replied softly. "And you are more than capable of entertaining your brother without my invisible management. I am quite sure Vittoria would be delighted to organize the catering, given her high standards for your family's reputation." Julian's jaw tightened. He searched my face for the familiar, comforting signs of a grievance he could fix. He expected a tearful accusation. He expected loud, chaotic anger. Anger was a language he understood. Anger was a transaction. It could be negotiated, intimidated, or bought off with an expensive apology. But my calm was an entirely different currency. It meant the negotiation had already ended. The winter draft rattling the loose window panes behind me swept through the room, chilling the air between us, but I did not shiver. "Have a good evening, Julian," I said gently. I began to slowly close the door. For a fraction of a second, his hand twitched at his side, as if he might press his palm against the wood to stop me. But he did not. He simply stood in the freezing, shadowy hallway, watching the gap narrow until the latch clicked shut, locking him out of my world entirely. The east wing had its own temperature, quiet, still, smelling of old cedar and undisturbed dust. The main quarters, by contrast, had devolved into a site of frantic, undirected energy. It had been 48 hours since I moved my belongings, changing nothing about the house except my daily participation in it. I stood in the shadows of the second-floor gallery, looking down at the open double doors of Julian's study. The morning light usually caught the immaculate mahogany of his desk, but today, the surface was buried under scattered files. For almost 10 years, his entire syndicate ran through a single object, the leather-bound dossier. I had cross-referenced his encrypted meetings with the security rotations, tracking safe routes and offshore transfers. I did this in complete silence, updating the heavy pages while my husband slept. Now the dossier was gone. I had simply locked it inside, a heavy safe in my new quarters, a space Julian was no longer permitted to enter. Marcus Brody stood before the mahogany desk, looking entirely defeated. The seasoned security chief held a chaotic stack of unclassified memos, his broad shoulders unusually tense. "Where is the master schedule, Marcus?" Julian's voice echoed against the marble floors, tight with suppressed panic. "I have a sit-down with the Chicago delegates in 3 hours. Where is the threat matrix?" "I don't have it, boss," the imposing man replied, his deep voice carrying a rare tremor. He placed the disorganized papers down. "I don't know the filing system. I never did." Julian dragged a hand over his face. "What do you mean? You're the head of security." "I run the men on the ground," the chief answered, perfectly steady but completely helpless. Mrs. Vance ran the logistics. Every route, every background check, every clearance code. She compiled it. She filtered the noise. We just followed the dossier she left on the hall table at dawn. I watched Julian freeze. His hand hovered over the scattered papers. The realization hit him, visible in the sudden stiffening of his spine. He had built a terrifying empire, but he had never actually operated it. He merely wore the crown while I silently maintained the machinery. He looked at the empty space where his operational logbook used to sit. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Marcus shifted his weight, glancing uncomfortably toward the hallway. He understood the gravity of the absence. I did not feel a rush of vindictive triumph. I only felt the cold clarity of a woman who had finally stopped carrying a massive structure by herself. I turned away from the balcony, leaving them to drown in the operational chaos they had always taken for granted. By noon, the administrative failure had bled into direct operational collapse. I sat in the adjoining parlor, carefully wiping the broad leaves of a neglected monstera plant with a damp cloth. Through the cracked door, the heavy, aggressive thud of boots in the foyer shattered. The quiet. Dante had arrived. My brother-in-law operated on the assumption that the world was his inherited property. He stormed directly into Julian's study, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who had just been deeply inconvenienced. "You missed the Port Authority handoff," the younger Vance snapped, slamming a briefcase onto the desk. 2 hours our men sat at the docks, waiting for the encrypted clearance codes. The harbor master threatened to impound the shipment. "What is going on?" I did not pause my work. I simply traced the vein of a green leaf, listening to the silence. "There was a scheduling error," Julian replied, his voice lacking its effortless command. "The security detail was operating on an outdated matrix." The younger man let out a harsh laugh. "A scheduling error? Mother warned you. You let that ordinary woman play secretary, and the second she throws a tantrum, your operation freezes. Go to the East Wing, drag your housekeeper back to her desk, and tell her to do her job." The silence that followed was highly combustible. I set my cloth down on the edge of the ceramic planter. "Do not ever." Julian's voice dropped into a lethal register he usually reserved for enemies. "Call my wife a housekeeper again." "Oh, please," his brother scoffed. "She manages your files. She's staff with a wedding ring. And because you can't control her, we nearly lost a $3 million container. She didn't just manage the files." A heavy chair scraped against the floor. "She maintained the entire infrastructure of this family. She mapped your safe routes. She kept you safe. And you sat at my dinner table and treated her like dirt. You insulted her lineage, and I sat there and let you." "Are you defending her?" the intruder demanded in disbelief. "After she crippled the operation?" I listened to the heavy footsteps retreat. The front door clicked shut. I stood in the parlor, looking at the vibrant leaf in my hand. Julian had finally defended me. He had recognized the massive architecture of my devotion. But as I picked up my watering can, I felt absolutely nothing. The defense had come only after he was personally inconvenienced. He wasn't mourning the loss of his wife's heart. He was panicking over the loss of his most reliable asset. Some words arrive far too late to resurrect what has already died. The most expensive mistakes are not the ones that cost money. They are the ones that cost trust. 1 week into the separation, Julian, a man who managed his syndicate through calculated force, decided to apply corporate tactics to our marriage. He could not grasp the architecture of an emotional wound, so he sought to pave over it with capital. I witnessed his desperation materialize into a transaction. Walking through the foyer, I passed the partially open doors of his study. Julian was standing behind his oversized desk, deep in conversation with Marcus. Marcus, whose career was built on tactical routing, looked distinctly uncomfortable holding glossy architectural photographs instead of security dossiers. Marcus understood physical threats. He did not understand how to secure a perimeter around a dying marriage. Julian's posture was rigid as he spread the images across the dark mahogany. From the hallway, I clearly saw the photographs. They depicted a brutal, breathtaking stretch of the Maine coastline. Gray ocean waves crashed against sharp rocks. Perched at the cliff's edge was a sprawling fortress of steel, stone, and glass. It was visually stunning, yet totally barren of human warmth. It looked exactly like the emotional climate of our current existence, merely relocated to a colder latitude. I watched Julian trace the property boundaries. His family had insulted my lineage during the winter banquet. Because he had lacked the courage to defend me with his voice, he was now trying to defend me with his wealth. He believed giving me an isolated kingdom, far away from Vittoria and Dante, would erase the humiliation. Marcus silently slid the heavy envelope across the desk. Julian uncapped his silver pen and signed the paperwork with aggressive strokes. He did not ask his security chief a single question about perimeter defenses. He just stared at the frozen Maine waters, trusting that a multi-million-dollar transaction could bridge the silent chasm between us. I stepped away from the door. He was trying to buy a new foundation for a house that had already burned down. Later that evening, the heavy oak door of the East Wing sitting room clicked open. I was seated by the window, the autumn rain rhythmically tapping against the glass panes. The room was sparsely decorated. I was holding my familiar glazed mug, letting the faint steam warm my face. The tea had grown lukewarm, but I found comfort in its simple, uninterrupted presence. Julian stepped into the room. Wearing his tailored charcoal suit, his silver cufflinks caught the dim light. Yet, standing on the edge of my faded rug, he simply looked exhausted. His dark eyes were shadowed with poor sleep. In his right hand, he carried the heavy envelope I had seen earlier in his study. He approached the small wooden table beside my armchair. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply placed the envelope onto the polished surface, sliding it toward my hand. "I bought a property today," Julian said, his voice carefully controlled. "In Maine, on the coast. It is entirely in your name, Elena. The villa deed, the surrounding land, the private accounts required to maintain it. All yours." He paused, his gaze meeting mine. "It is far away from my mother, Dante, and the noise of the syndicate. A place where you will be absolutely protected." He was waiting for me to tear open the envelope and throw my arms around him. He expected the grand gesture to reset the emotional clock, washing away the indignity of the banquet with the weight of his financial power. I looked down at the stack of legal paper. The seaside villa deed represented pristine luxury, but it was entirely silent on the matter of respect. A man who truly respects his wife does not hide her away in a fortress to protect her from his family. He demands that his family respects her while she stands right beside him. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a theatrical speech about how my dignity was not for sale. Instead, I carefully set my vessel down. Extending my right hand, I placed my fingertips lightly against the edge of the heavy envelope. With a smooth motion, I pushed the millions of dollars of coastal real estate a few inches to the left, merely to make enough room to rest my saucer properly on the table. "That is a very generous thought, Julian," I said softly. I looked up at him with a polite, empty expression, the exact pleasant look one might give to a courteous hotel concierge. "I am sure it is a beautiful location. Thank you." Julian froze. His breath caught violently in his throat. He stared at the envelope, completely untouched, sitting uselessly beside my tea. He had braced himself for a screaming match. Anger carried volume, sadness carried weight, but this absolute, composed politeness meant the battle was over. He had no defense against it. "Elena," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. He reached out, his hand hovering over the small table, but he lacked the courage to close the remaining distance. "You do not even want to look at the photographs." "There is no need," I replied quietly, taking a slow sip from my cup. "I already know what cold looks like." The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. He stood there in his immaculate suit, utterly paralyzed by a polite rejection. His wealth was completely powerless against a woman who had stopped needing him to be her savior. He slowly stepped back, the reality of the permanent, invisible wall between us finally settling into his bones. I did not make a habit of returning to the main quarters. The air there had grown too heavy, suffocated by the ghosts of a life I no longer maintained. But that Thursday afternoon, I needed a specific set of winter coats stored in the cedar closets of the upper gallery. The house below was eerily quiet, lacking the rhythmic hum of coordination that used to define its pulse. From the second-floor landing, I heard the heavy oak doors of the grand foyer swing open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of Victoria Vance's heels echoed across the marble floor. She did not walk, she invaded. The reception hall below offered undeniable proof of my absence. The grand floral arrangements, once changed every Tuesday morning, were wilting, their brown petals scattered across the polished stone. The silver trays on the console tables were tarnished, and a faint layer of dust caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows. Victoria stopped in the center of the foyer. Her voice, always carrying the sharp edge of inherited authority, sliced through the silence. She demanded to know where the housekeeper was. She demanded to know why the estate looked like a neglected tomb. Then, her anger found its favorite target. She began to loudly criticize me, her words dripping with the same aristocratic disdain she had wielded at the banquet. She called me useless. She claimed I had abandoned my post out of spite, a commoner failing to uphold the standards of the syndicate. I stood in the shadows of the gallery, my hand resting lightly on the cold mahogany railing. I felt no urge to defend myself. The insults no longer had the power to bruise. Anger was loud. Sadness was loud. Calm meant something had already ended. Below, the heavy door of the study opened. Julian Vance emerged. He did not look like the untouchable empire builder who had sat beside me at the gala. His suit jacket was missing. The top buttons of his shirt were undone, and the dark shadows under his eyes spoke of long nights spent pacing empty rooms. Victoria turned to him, expecting her son to echo her disgust. She pointed a manicured finger at a dusty side table, demanding he discipline his wife for such a public failure of duty. Julian stopped at the edge of the foyer. He did not yell or raise his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was dangerously flat, carrying a coldness that made the ambient temperature in the room plummet. He looked at the dust on the table, then up at his mother. He told her, with absolute, terrifying calm, that the dust was there because the woman who used to sweep it away had finally realized she was entirely unappreciated. Victoria bristled, opening her mouth to issue another command. Julian cut her off. His voice dropped to a quiet, lethal whisper. He told his mother that she was welcome to retrieve a cloth and clean the reception hall herself, or she could turn around and leave his estate immediately. He added that if she ever spoke my name with disrespect in his house again, she would not be welcomed back. Victoria stared at him, her face draining of color. The silence that followed was absolute. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out, the heavy doors closing softly behind her. I watched my husband stand alone in the ruined foyer, breathing heavily, defending my honor to an empty room. It was the protection I had needed on the night of the banquet. It was the loyalty I had spent years trying to earn. But fatal blows to a partnership do not always sever the bond upon impact. The quiet rot takes hold the second you internalize the harsh reality. A shield raised after the battle is already lost, provides no comfort. I felt a fleeting wave of pity for him, but no triumph. I simply turned away and walked silently back toward the east wing. The estate was particularly still that evening, the kind of quiet that settles right before a heavy winter snow. I found myself walking back through the main corridor, retrieving a forgotten scarf from the library. As I passed the half-open door of the primary study, a slice of warm, amber light spilled onto the hallway floor. I stopped. Through the narrow gap, I could see Julian. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. The room was dark, save for the single brass reading lamp illuminating the surface in front of him. There were no financial ledgers spread out. There were no security briefings or operational maps. Instead, resting directly in the center of his desk was the leather-bound dossier. It was the operational guide I had kept for years, the quiet architecture of his entire existence. I had left it behind when I moved out, assuming it would be thrown away or ignored. Julian was hunched over it, his broad shoulders curved in a posture of utter defeat. He was slowly turning the thick pages. From where I stood, the silence was so profound I could hear the faint, dry rustle of the paper. I knew exactly what was written on those pages. They did not contain complaints or demands. They held the meticulous, invisible labor of a woman who had desperately loved him. I stood in the shadows, watching his finger trace a line of my neat handwriting. It was the section dedicated to his family's seasonal visits. I had recorded Victoria's specific allergies, the exact temperature her guest suite needed to be kept at, and the rare blend of Earl Grey tea she preferred to drink at 4 o'clock. I had documented Dante Vance's dietary restrictions and the precise brand of scotch to keep stocked in his quarters. Julian was staring at the undeniable proof of how deeply I had cared for the very people who had despised me. He was looking at the endless, unpaid, unnoticed work I had performed to ensure his empire ran without friction. He stopped turning the pages, his hand flattened against the open book. For a long time, he simply stared at the ink, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Then, very slowly, the most feared man in the syndicate lowered his head. He pressed his face into his hands, his fingers burying into his dark hair. A single ragged exhale broke the silence of the study. A man who measured his life in leverage and fear was finally sitting in the ruins of his own indifference. There was no enemy for him to fight, no rival to crush. He was simply drowning under the weight of everything I was no longer doing. He had always operated under the assumption that his wealth provided the foundation of our marriage. The physical object beneath his hands proved the opposite. I had been the one carrying the house. I stood in the hallway, watching the man I had once arranged my entire universe around. I did not step into the light. I did not offer him comfort, nor did I feel the urge to punish him further. His realization belonged entirely to him. I adjusted the scarf over my shoulders, turning my back on the amber light of the study. The hallway ahead was dark, but it no longer felt like a prison. I walked quietly back to the east wing, leaving him alone with the ghosts of my handwriting. By the following afternoon, I stood in the center of the estate's original glass conservatory. The warm, humid air smelled faintly of wet earth and crushed jasmine. After the vast, echoing chill of the main house, this small greenhouse felt like a living, breathing sanctuary. I was repotting a row of white orchids, my fingers brushing the delicate roots, entirely absorbed in the quiet rhythm of the task. Overhead, the low hum of the automated heaters provided a steady, grounding drone. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set, casting long, fractured shadows across the condensation-heavy glass panes. Then the heavy iron latch of the door clicked open. I did not turn immediately. I recognized the measured, deliberate cadence of the footsteps on the stone threshold. Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a gentleness that felt entirely foreign to his nature. He did not bring his phone. He was not flanked by Marcus or any of his usual security personnel. Dressed simply in a charcoal sweater, the tailored armor of his suits had been discarded. He walked down the narrow gravel path, stopping a few feet away from my workstation. For a long time, he just watched me work. The silence stretched between us, but it was no longer heavy with unspoken resentment. It was simply fragile. "I used to think my power was absolute," he said, his voice low. Stripped of the commanding resonance he used to control boardrooms and syndicate lieutenants. He did not move closer. Instead, he lowered himself onto a weathered wooden bench near the hydrangeas, resting his elbows on his knees. I wiped a smudge of damp soil from the rim of a terracotta pot, waiting. "When my mother spoke to you at the banquet, I heard every word," he continued, the admission slipping out in a quiet, steady exhale. He looked down at his hands, intertwining his fingers as if trying to anchor himself. "I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself it was strategy, that reacting would only validate their disrespect." He paused, taking a slow, ragged breath. But that was a lie. It was cowardice. The word hung in the humid air. I stopped moving, a small pruning shear resting lightly in my palm. I sat there, Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I chose my family's pride over my wife's dignity. I watched them tear you down, and I swirled my drink. I thought because you didn't cry, because you didn't scream, that it hadn't broken you. He finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine with a raw, unprotected clarity. I was terrified of losing the respect of a family that only respects fear, and in the process, I threw away the only person who actually cared if I made it home. He did not ask for forgiveness. He offered no rationalizations, no promises of expensive vacations, or threats of grand retaliation against Vittoria. He simply sat on the wooden bench, a man whose empire meant nothing inside this small, humid room, and named the exact architecture of his failure. "You built my entire life," he whispered, "and I let them treat you like a ghost." I looked at him, absorbing the weight of his confession. For the first time in 8 years, he was not the untouchable head of the Vance family. He was just Julian, confronting the wreckage of his own choices. I reached out and picked up the pruning shears. With a soft, decisive snap, I clipped a dead, withered leaf from the base of a nearby fern. It fluttered to the damp gravel floor. "Cruelty leaves bruises you can point to," I said quietly, setting the shears down. "Indifference leaves nothing visible at all. I believed the indifference you chose that night, Julian." He flinched slightly, but he did not look away. He remained seated, accepting the boundary. "I am not leaving the estate," I told him, my tone perfectly even, "but I am not returning to the main house. I will stay in the East Wing. I will manage my own schedule, my own accounts, and my own days. I will attend the necessary public functions, and we will be polite to one another." Julian swallowed hard, the reality of my terms settling over him. "Politeness," he murmured, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "People often mistake politeness for peace," I explained, tracing the edge of a ceramic pot. "They are not the same thing. Peace requires absolute trust. Politeness simply requires distance. And the distance is permanent," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The marriage we had is over," I replied. My voice was steady, without malice, but stripped of the warmth he used to take for granted. "You cannot buy it back with a villa in Maine. You cannot fix it by firing staff or fighting with Dante. That version of me. The woman who anticipated your every need, who absorbed your family's cruelty so you could remain comfortable, she is gone." Julian slowly nodded, the gesture heavy, with a grief he was finally allowing himself to feel. He stood up from the wooden bench, his tall frame looking strangely diminished under the canopy of hanging vines. He did not reach for my hand. He understood that any attempt to touch me would be a violation of the fragile truce we had just established. "I will not cross the threshold of the East Wing without your permission," he promised, his voice rough but clear, "and I will not ask for anything you are not willing to give." "Thank you," I said softly. He lingered for just a moment longer, looking at the warm light filtering through the glass, before turning and walking back down the gravel path. The heavy iron latch clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the fragrant quiet. I picked up my small silver watering can and turned back to the orchids. I poured a gentle stream over the delicate roots, nurturing a life that belonged solely to me. Outside, the winter fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the sharp, clear outlines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The vast estate was still silent, but it was no longer a cage. As I listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of water hitting the dry soil, the quiet felt exactly like an open road.